Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of our Africa Travels of Interesting People podcast. Today, we've got Dr. Andrew Baxter. Andrew Baxter is a PhD in this topic we're going to get into. But before we get there, I just want to paint a picture about South African tourism. And, you know, we try and go out there and we try and compete against the 200 countries in the world, against incredible India and marvelous Malaysia, and yet we've got one of the greatest untold stories on the planet. And that's what we're going to explore today, is this whole issue of when people arrive in Africa, they feel it's so at home. Why is that? Andrew, great to have you. Thanks for giving us your time. Give us a bit of your background and also why your interest in human origins and archaeology.
Well, thank you, Colin, and thank you to all the people that are listening in on this podcast. I hope you find it interesting. So, my home is in Cape Town, South Africa, and I grew up on the slopes of Table Mountain. Went to the University of Cape Town, and part of my postgraduate degree was to explore a unique cave that had been found on Table Mountain, to explore the paleo history or the paleo ecology of the mountain in that area. And yeah, I mean, the exciting thing that emerged from that was that right at the bottom of this deep sequence of sediment in the cave, as we were excavating down it, we came across these stone tools from a bygone era. We're now going back 30 odd years, Colin, and in those days, radiocarbon dating was unable to accurately determine who and when those stone tools, or who the people that made them, and from what period they dated. And they were kind of ignored, put in a box and sent to the Eco Museum, and I continued with my studies. But it piqued in me this curiosity about people and place, and who these people were that were living in this very remote part of the mountain, high up in a kind of an environment that isn't really conducive to a home site. I was curious, and it piqued my curiosity. The long story is that I've had a lifelong interest in archaeology. I continued a degree in the subject. I went on to do a PhD in paleoecology and worked in some of the most preeminent archaeological sites around the southern and western Cape Coast of South Africa, exploring all sorts of ideas around how changing climate and changing environments might have shifted human behavior. Yeah, I still am spellbound by these questions that come up. And yeah, as you know, Colin, I was out there yesterday uncovering some more secrets.
And then you started a business called Cape Storm. And I mean, how do you reconcile the two? A Cape Storm, hardcore retail business, creating obviously outdoor products, which are great, and tying it in with the archaeology.
Yeah, it was a bit of an interesting diversion away from academia and hard science. I think at some point I just needed to explore a different aspect of myself, and the creativity of making really good outdoor gear and being creative and going into a different trajectory was enticing. But you also know my backstory.
You're talking Nunu's, man. You were freezing on the top of the mountain and you wanted some decent kit.
That's true. That is absolutely okay. That is absolutely correct. But you also know my backstory, Colin, and you know that at some point that was no longer an appealing trajectory, and I've come full circle and now back into the space that I really enjoy.
So let's get on to anatomically modern human beings. You know, we've seen all these, all been to the cradle of humankind outside Johannesburg. We've seen those ancient fossils from millions of years ago, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about us, Homo sapiens. Where did anatomically modern human beings, i.e. us, start to show the very first evidence of art, science, and technology, and create this whole thing of welcome home when people arrived back in Africa? Tell us that story.
Yes, well, as you know, our human origins extend back probably 6 million years or even more. And much of that early fossil evidence, as you rightly point out, is contained in places like the cradle of humankind up in Gauteng. But the real question that has emerged in recent years is, where did we, as modern human beings, Homo sapiens, arise? Where in the world did we arise? And it's been a fairly contentious issue because there have been some posits that we might have arisen in different parts of the world. But the collective and overwhelming scientific evidence at the moment is that we modern human beings all arose somewhere in Africa. And we'll get into the detail about where somewhere is shortly. The point at which we became recognizable as anatomically modern human beings, in other words, our forebears, is a little blurry because, as you can imagine, it wasn't just a sudden event. We didn't suddenly emerge from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. There were stepping stones in between, and that point at which we became fully modern humans is perhaps not a precise point. But many people think science suggests that it was around about 200,000 years ago. So, in geological terms, relatively recently. And there is convincing evidence that that event occurred, or the place in which we evolved to become recognizably modern human beings was somewhere in Africa. Increasingly, that looks like, from different sources of evidence, archaeological evidence and genetic evidence, that location is probably somewhere in southern Africa and possibly somewhere near the Central Kalahari. And we know that the people that have always occupied that area would have had networks, and that they would have interacted with people in South and Southern Africa. So that is really a good starting point for where we evolved to become modern humans. But the real question then is, when did modern human behavior become expressed in the fossil record or the archaeological record? Because evolving into a modern human being and then showing behavioral traits that we would recognize today, things like cognition, abstract thought, art, thinking about the future, food preparation, the evolution of clothing, the evolution and development, for example, of stone tool technologies and other tools, art. All of these things are a representation and set us apart from other hominids and other primates, but they're a representation of being fully human. And where did that take place? And it appears overwhelmingly from the archaeological evidence that is now emerging from super duper exciting sites along the South Cape Coast and the Western Cape Coast, that place was in South Africa, or the southern tip of Africa as we know it.
Absolutely. So we've got extraordinary excavations taking place right now around De Hoop Preserve. We've got the Klipdrift shelter and the Klipdrift cave inside De Hoop, which is going to be started again. We're just outside to the east. We've got Blombos Cave, and your old academia sort of co-student, Professor Chris Henshelwood. Tell us about those. What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it's super exciting that we've got these deep sequence cave sites, which serve as they sit along the coast. So there's a geological formation currently where the coastline is that is enabled through long periods of time, caves to develop through erosion. And it's not surprising that human beings, our ancestors in the past, would have found those cave sites an attractive place to seek refuge or to live in, particularly when they were close to the marine environment, because the marine environment, it turns out, has had a profound impact on our cultural evolution as a food source. So these cave sites along the coast in De Hoop and nearby along the coast serve as a repository for the evidence that people lived in them and what they left behind. So over long periods of time, as these caves have been inhabited, perhaps not constantly, but ephemerally, and people coming in and out, and they've left a signature in the sediments as they've accumulated over time. And so you get a cake layer going back down in time that the archaeologists are able to excavate down into. They're able to get fairly accurate dates back into the past, and they're able to find cultural artifacts and remnants and evidence of how people lived in the past in these layers, which then they're able to interpret as in all sorts of manners. I mean, they can determine what the environment was doing. They can determine what people were eating. And there are these clues around our human behavior contained in these stratigraphic sites. So there's ongoing excavations at Blombos Cave, which has been really important, and now these other caves closer to De Hoop or in De Hoop Nature Reserve that are going to continue to reveal these secrets. So every season that the archaeologists are back, there's new and exciting evidence is emerging to explain our past.
So what I heard is that your old lecturer, comrade, student, Chris Henshelwood, went out and he raised something like 660 million euros to go and assemble the best team of scientists, right the way from archaeologists through to psychologists and climatologists. I mean, why is that important in this whole story? Why is science actually needing to have such a diverse bunch of different disciplines to make the story come alive?
Well, I think the driver behind all of this is this insatiable human curiosity to know about, who we are, where we came from, and how we survived in times of fairly hostile and dynamic shifts in the environment and climate. Um, and I think that curiosity about knowing how and when, we evolved, and under what conditions has been part of that. That's the big question, and that's what drives the curiosity. Now, in trying to unpack our human history, it's like a big giant jigsaw puzzle. Colin, if I threw a 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle in front of you, and gave you 10 pieces, I mean, that's essentially, and told you to paint the picture with the 10 pieces, that's essentially what an archaeologist is trying to do. They get a tiny little snapshot of what life was like in the past. But if we brought in paleoclimatologists, and we brought in people that understand paleontologists, and we brought in sedimentologists and oceanographers, and we brought in paleobotanists, and we brought in these psychologists and anthropologists, each of them is also getting 10 pieces of the puzzle. So, if you then assemble maybe 100 pieces of the 5,000 piece puzzle, or maybe 500 pieces or 1,000 pieces, you start to get a much clearer picture. And that's why there's this multidimensional facet to these studies that are able to unpack so much more information. Bear in mind, they're also telling us a lot of stuff about our planet. Things like, what was happening when the oceans were much lower during the ice ages, and how quickly they rose in response to climate change, because those are proxies for what we're currently going through and what we're going to go through as human beings going forward. And there's some very valuable clues in terms of how we manage to adapt and survive periods of epic climate change and sea level rise.
So that whole area around De Hoop, I'm involved with Lekkerwater, you're involved with Lekkerwater, and we have to disclose that. Apologies. It's such a crucial area in this whole story. Why is the human behavioral development and these people and their trays sort of, why did it develop there? And then what happened afterwards with Homo sapiens to go out and then populate the world? Essentially, what I'm getting at, Andrew, is how do we get to the point of saying that each and every person on this planet can trace their ancestry back to this chunk of the planet, and actually we all have the same ancestors? We all, it almost makes this whole race debate irrelevant if we all came from the same people. Sort of expand a little bit on that, because that's where I'm kind of murky.
Let's break it out into two trays there. The first is this notion of that every single living person on the planet today can trace their origins back to a focal point, or to perhaps even a single ancestor, loosely defined as our mitochondrial Eve. Now, this is a genetic concept, and the science is showing us that our DNA, there's DNA that sits in the mitochondrium that is passed down from only the mother to the offspring. And so through just the female lineage back in time, or forward in time, that DNA is passed on from daughter to daughter to daughter. It may end up in a son, but then it terminates. But if every female on the planet today can effectively, on that basis, trace their ancestry back to a common focal point, which we believe, or the geneticists are telling us, is somewhere around 160 to 200,000 years ago. And what that's telling us is that it's not telling us that was the first person or first woman on the planet, or the only woman, but it's the one that effectively has accounted for every single living person on the planet today. And that's a huge thing to wrap your head around, that there is this kind of almost biblical Eve that existed sometime in the past, and that she has existed in Southern Africa. And what that is telling us then is that every single person alive on the planet today, whether they are an Inuit, an Aboriginal, if they are Japanese, if they are South American, or African, we are all somehow related, and can trace our ancestry back. We are all effectively Africans. We're all Southern Africans, and we've spread through successive leakages out of the African continent into Asia and Eurasia, and populated the world. So it's a beautiful story because this is like a homecoming. So anyone returning to Africa from anywhere who's never been here before is effectively coming home, like the prodigal son or prodigal daughter. They're coming back to the place from whence they originated. And Colin, just to sidetrack into that, I mean, the number of times I've heard people or listened to people telling the story to an audience and witnessed the emotions amongst those in the audience as they sort of make the connection and they click and the tears roll down their face. It's almost like a relief for them to realize that this feeling that they've had when they've arrived in South Africa and they're sitting in a remote place staring out the sea, this feeling of sort of, they can't really describe it, but it's clarified through the story. I mean, it is really quite a thing of beauty. So that's the ancestral part where we all came from, and we can talk later about how we radiated out into the rest of the world and how difficult that was and how that looked. But coming back to the human behavior side, which is the second part of your question, why did that evolve? What was the trigger for these behavioral traits to be expressed at Lekavata on the Southern Cape Coast, around that area? What was the driver behind that? Well, I think there are a number of things that are coming out as explanations for that. The environment is certainly a key driver. The fact that the environment is dynamic was also a key driver, and that there may have been significant hardships which would have also forced the evolution and development of behavioral traits in order to survive. So what we have along the Southern Cape Coast is a marine environment intersecting a terrestrial environment where there were lots of different resources. And at times, those resources would have been bountiful and plentiful. And at other times, they would have been not so bountiful and not so plentiful. And that would have forced the hand of the people living there to develop different survival strategies. So just to paint the picture again, at the moment, if you go to Lekavata and you can sit there and watch the whales, if you only went back 10,000 years in time or 12,000 years back in time, the coastline would have been 60, 70, 80 kilometers away. Sea level dropped 140 meters. And in front of you would not have been an ocean, but a vast plain, a grassy plain that would have supported large ungulates, unrecognizable today, different, sturdy Cape buffalo and things that have subsequently become extinct. But I mean, it would have been a proliferation of animals grazing out there and would have provided a food source for the people that were living in that area. And they would have been able to use that as hunting ground, but there was also the marine environment. And then very quickly, the climate changed, and actually at a rate that is almost unprecedented, certainly in recent human history. The sea level came up dramatically, such that even in an individual's lifetime, it might have moved many kilometers closer in a single person's lifetime, dramatic changes. And that would have been a huge disruptor. And in these disruptions of breaking, the procurement of food and hunter-gathering, it is thought that this was created a dynamic environment for people to be responsive to how they would have dealt with shifting climate, shifting temperature, shifting foodstuffs, competition between each other, and that this led in some way to the sort of the evolution of cognition in a way that enabled us to be resilient and to develop all of these coping strategies that make us modern humans as we know today.
Andrew, I remember hearing once that it was explained to me that for the first time in history, when that marine coastline was close to the caves, a woman and a child could go out and forage for an hour and a half and get all the minerals they need, everything they needed, the whole bank shoot, all the micronutrients, all the everything to start developing the brain. And if that's the case, then they had something like 22 hours to do what? Because they were no longer on the chase and all that. Is that a fair sort of kind of layman's summary of the time when humans started to be able to get together and socialize, or is that too much of a kind of simplification of things?
There's no doubt that at times of stable climate, when the marine level was stable, that the coastal area around De Hoop Nature Reserve, Lekavata, and the Southern Cape Coast would have been absolutely bountiful. And we know that from evidence that has come out in the archaeological record, from skeletal material that's been analyzed, that has shown us that there was this huge dependency on the marine environment. You and I both know that it wouldn't take us long to go down to the rocky shoreline, and within 20 minutes, half an hour, we'd be able to reap enough mussels and other sea life from the intertidal pools and the fish traps that might have been there, and scavenging from carcasses on the beach that might have washed up. It wouldn't take us more than 40 minutes to provide our daily nutritional requirement. And so you're quite right. There would have been a huge amount of free time to do other stuff. And what would that other stuff have been? We could have expressed ourselves artistically. We could have made tools. We could have engaged in social interactions. And our brains would have been flooded by omega-3 fatty acids from a predominantly marine diet. So there is a line of thought that says that this period of time and this location, 160,000 years ago, when we start to see the first very evident expression in the archaeological record of these wonderful modern human behavioral traits, could have been commensurate with exactly as you've described, bountiful marine resources and other resources, and lots of time to be able to do other things, and through socialization with people, developing vocabulary, art, improved technology through stone tool development, etc., may well have been the sort of the foundation, the flint of the fire that became, these made us modern human in our behavior. So it is absolutely correct. However, there would have been other times, Colin, in this period when it would have been a fairly hostile environment, because climate change and environmental change has never been linear or consistent. It's been sporadic, and at times of great change, and there have been some epic changes along the way. It would have put people under duress, and that duress could also have been part of developing survival strategies that in turn have fostered our behavioral development.
Sure. Fascinating. Yeah, so how come South African tourism hasn't taken this as their big story? Welcome home. Each and every person is coming back to their roots. You think about roots and all the African Americans going to West Africa. Why do you think it hasn't happened? Or is this just such a new story, a new developing that we haven't really had the chance for?
Yeah, I think it's an emerging story. It's super exciting. I mean, as you said, there's some big excavations coming up shortly with Professor Chris Senshelwood and his colleagues. And this focus on this particular period of time in archaeology is a relatively recent development. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, the Middle Stone Age was kind of like people were ignoring it. They were focused on other time periods and other big questions. But as you know, these science evolves and questions evolved. And now, particularly with the development of these incredible genetic tools that enable us to ask questions that formerly we had no answers for, it's shone a spotlight on the Middle Stone Age and our human development.
Okay, fantastic. Sure. Yeah. Andrea, we're just running out of time, but listen, that's wonderful. I think that we've got lots of exciting stuff to look forward to as these caves get deeper and deeper in the excavations and more scientists get involved. And I really hope that the spotlight really does start shining more brightly on the southern Cape Coast and in South Africa in particular, and we can sort of start to have more of a kind of welcome home roots kind of movement. Everybody comes to look at find their ancestry and find their home. So Dr. Andrew Baxter, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Welcome home.